and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marcia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Wheat prices are soaring once again. This as Russia has announced that it will not renew a UN-brokered deal that was agreed upon in July of 2022. The agreement was supposed to help stabilize wheat prices after they started rising following the beginning of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. In the agreement, Russia had allowed Ukrainian wheat to be exported via the Black Sea without targeting its ships. However, Russia says that though it abided by its part of the deal, others did not abide by their end of the bargain. Thus, according to Moscow, there will be no deal until Russia's demands are also met. Well, we're going to take a look at all of this on this Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. And out of Bristol, historian, investigative journalist, and a former BBC employee, Tony Gosling, thank you both for being with me. Well, let me start this off in New York. And Andrij, how important do you see this Black Sea initiative?
It's very important for the entire world. You mentioned the grain prices earlier. We know that when this deal was brokered the first time, grain prices dropped 20% almost immediately. And it is this unilateral action happening by the aggressor state to Ukraine's north, cutting off this food in contravention of the agreements made with Turkey, which is willing to send ships into the Black Sea to protect those grain ships. At the beginning of this full-fledged aggression in February of 2022, we had full silos in Ukraine, full silos of last year's wheat ready to go out, and it was allowed to rot there, or some places were actually being targeted by Russia. So this is a boon for the rest of the world when the deal was signed, a bad deal for the rest of the world when Russia pulled out.
Your take, Tony, your perspective of why you think Russia has pulled out of the deal.
Well, it's interesting to hear my colleague there talk about Russia as the aggressor state, because maybe he can't remember back in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. It is that the United States and NATO promised faithfully that they wouldn't move any of their troops up to the border. They wouldn't take advantage of the fact that these countries were now independent to colonize them, to bring them into NATO. And of course, that's exactly what's happened. And the Russians are understandably concerned that NATO is advancing right up to their borders, rather like the Soviet Union, you could argue, did when they started putting missiles into Cuba back in the 1960s, advancing up to the United States border. So this is not an aggressive act by the Russians, it's a defensive act. And of course, anyone that looks into what's been going on in Ukraine will know that the Russians moved in February last year, in 2022, because the Ukrainian army was about to attack the Donbass and break the Minsk agreement. This is this Russian-speaking area in the southeast of Ukraine. But if you're looking at what's been going on with grain, I think, even if you're looking at negotiations in the world of the Olympics, in sport, in almost every field, including things like chemical weapons, many of these international bodies are being basically occupied and controlled now by the NATO bloc. And the main reason that there's been problems with this grain shipment, it seems to me, is because of the massive insurance that many of the ship owners are now having to pay. They believe that at any time this war could escalate and the ships carrying the grain, so I think, could be blown up in the sea. So I think there needs to be obviously some kind of plan B where this grain, of course, could be moved around quite efficiently and quite effectively by other means, for example, by train around the world. Ship is the cheapest way of doing it. But if the West is not prepared to do honest deals with the Russians, then I'm afraid, of course, the Russians are just simply going to have to pull out of the deal.
What about that, Andrij? You heard what Tony said. If the West is not ready to deal with Russia honestly, the Russian side is saying that with this agreement, they kept their side of the agreement, but the other side did not keep their side of the agreement. Your take on that?
I think there's report after report laying lie to that statement. Obviously, I'm, as most everybody here, are against wars that are launched without any precept. The war, just like the Iraq War, being launched on the idea that there might be weapons of mass destruction. Same thing here, as a preemptive war to possibly have some NATO troops in Ukraine. I believe that's the proposition. Nobody here believes in this. War should not be preemptive. If an aggressor state, like the aggressor state to Ukraine's north, begins a war, it is every country's right to defend itself from that. In terms of the lies being given, the very beginning of this full-fledged aggression in February 22 was when Russia held illegally, I must add, but Russia controlled the Security Council for the month of February and denied repeatedly that it was launching a war, in contravention of almost every military analyst around the world. And then when it launched the war, it continued to say that it wasn't launching a war, up until President Putin released a video statement saying that, yes, he's indeed launching a preemptive war against Ukraine. Again, you have to look at report after report after report. There was a report issued just this month about children in war zones being affected by Russia, the effect on elderly in Ukraine by the aggressor state of Russia. So everything that Russia is saying, if it's asking to be taken at face value, it shouldn't be ripping up peace agreements. It shouldn't be ripping up any of 4 international agreements that it did when it invaded Ukraine. So it's on the aggressor state to come back into the fold of international agreement.
Tony, your take on this whole agreement, because again, we're going to go back to what Russia is saying. It's saying that one of the agreements, the other side was supposed to actually lift the sanctions and allow Russia to export food and fertilizer, also to help with a major agricultural lender with a SWIFT payment system, giving them the okay in order to help with the problems that they have in insuring Russian cargo. The Russians are saying that none of these agreements were fulfilled. Thus, they kept the agreement for 1 year, but now have decided to cancel on it. Your take on what Moscow is saying?
Well, it's very similar to what happened with the Minsk agreement, because the Ukraine and the West simply didn't keep to that. This is when there was supposed to be a ceasefire in the Donbass. What happened was, and this is back in 2014, 2015, after the Victoria Nuland's coup in Kiev, and at that point, there was an agreement signed in Minsk, and the Ukrainians simply didn't keep to it. They kept shelling into the Donbass, and about 15,000 people, we're not talking about soldiers here, we're talking about mostly civilians, died during that period. So, you know, I don't think, and also, of course, when Zelensky was first elected, he was elected on a platform of actually stopping this conflict in the Donbass. Then the Ukrainian Nazis approached him after he was elected and threatened to kill him if he stopped the aggression in the Donbass. And so, of course, he didn't do that. And then we had the war break out. So I think we need to just understand that you can only actually untangle a war like this if you start to face the facts and reality about who the aggressors are. And the Russians quite clearly are now fighting not just Ukraine, but they're fighting NATO. This morning we had the attack on the Kerch Bridge. Both of the directions of the road part of that bridge blown up. Now, that wasn't just Ukraine on its own. Much of the equipment that's being used in attacks like this, and of course almost all of the satellite imagery and the electronic warfare side of these things, is supplied by NATO. So NATO is massively engaged in this conflict in Ukraine, and the Russians know that. And I think what we're going to see is this will just simply continue. Now, there are signs here in the UK that many of our senior people at the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence are recognising that if we carry on this course, supporting this Ukraine-Russia conflict, that Britain will start to get embroiled in a war with Russia. Obviously, they can see the dangers of that. Many of the army generals here in Britain are telling them that we don't want a war with Russia because we certainly certainly couldn't win it, and also it would mean a massive number of casualties, both of our soldiers and of possibly civilians here in the UK. So we've seen this weekend Ben Wallace announce, this is the British Defence Secretary who was slated to become the new Secretary General of NATO, actually resign, saying, well, he hasn't actually resigned now, he's going to be resigning in a few weeks' time. So he's had enough, basically. He's saying, look, and he's warning, he's saying, look, the way we're heading now, we could be at war with Russia or with China by the year 2030. And so he's stepping away from it. He's saying, I want nothing more to do either with NATO or with this policy. And we've seen exactly the same thing happening with Dominic Raab, the former Foreign Secretary, a year or so ago, when there was a British warship that came into the waters, tried to provoke the Russians. Dominic Raab spoke against it, and he was then booted out of government. We've also seen, of course, Boris Johnson resign recently. So there are many people in the British Conservative ruling party who are really throwing up their hands and saying we want nothing more to do with this NATO policy. And they're quite right to do that, I think.
Well, your take on that, Andrij, it just seems that this situation is escalating more and more each day. And it doesn't seem that talks or basically, it doesn't seem like either side are talking to each other. I mean, your take on where this is going, it just seems to be getting worse and worse in general, the whole conflict. Your take?
I don't know what you mean by worse and worse. I do know that thanks to the Alliance of Nations who are supporting freedom and democracy, Ukraine has received an incremental slate of weapons, more munitions by the month, and that has helped Ukraine gain kilometers of territory just in the last week, over 18 square kilometers, but it's been kilometers a day since they started coming and liberating the area that Russia has occupied for many months now. Much of that area will have to be demined. We're talking about 20 to 30% of a country that is full of landmines. Many serious war crimes happening, whether you're talking about the stealing of children, the sexual violence against women as old as 82 or children as young as 4. This is all happening on Ukrainian territory. So I return again to the condemnation of preemptive wars, which I think we all agree. We all agree also that a country has the right to defend itself. And Russia right now, to return to your initial topic, Russia right now is threatening the rest of the world by, again, threatening international food supplies. Ukraine supplied the bulk of food, the bulk of grain to many Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian countries. That lack of grain, if the prices were to go up and make it unfeasible for those countries to get basic grain supplies, could destabilize some governments, and that would threaten war in other parts of the world, which is exactly what the United Nations does not want to happen, and why we're going to see a press conference at the United Nations in about half hour's time.
Well, Tony, what about that? With this agreement, that the grain agreement, why do you think that, from what Moscow is saying, that the other side have not kept their side of it? If they did not want this situation to deteriorate, and of course the situation with increased prices and also just hunger and poverty in general increasing. So why wouldn't they keep their side of the deal?
Well, the West won't keep its side of the deal for the same reason as Zelensky didn't keep his side of the deal in Minsk. It's because, actually, they want a war. I mean, the West now, as we've seen with places like Syria and Iraq, they like these long, long wars, what George Orwell framed as the endless war, that actually... what it does is it gives a fantastic amount of money to the arms industry. So the arms industry is constantly supplying, replenishing, and you end up with a country like Britain, which is really not producing it very much at all, except war expertise. And and of course the United States is now supplying most of Europe with its weaponry, and so they like these endless wars. It keeps up a kind of bullying pressure on Russia, on China, on Iran and other countries, and that's the main object, I think, of the failure of the West to keep to any of these agreements. And I remember Putin saying about 3 or 4 years ago, he said that the United States is not deal ready. Now this means that when they're sitting down at the table and negotiating, they're constantly thinking, well, how long is this deal going to last? And is there any point in really signing the deal? And of course, that's what's happened today with the grain deal, because the West has simply not done what they said they would do. And, for example, reinstitute the SWIFT payment system, to drop many of the sanctions against Russia. And they just haven't done it. So what's the point in signing a deal with people who constantly welch on the deal? So I think really the West is on this kind of death trip in a way, in that they are completely obsessed with undermining Putin, undermining Russia, so that they can open up Russian markets and Russian raw materials for them to devour. And that is actually what's really motivating this, is we've got these two separate systems. We've got democracies in the East, obviously not in China, but certainly in Russia. And in the West, we don't have, I mean, certainly I just had my colleague talking about the alliance of democracies. There's no democracy whatsoever in Ukraine. It's a dictatorship with no political activity opposing the government allowed. And here in Britain, for example, the British people elected somebody called Boris Johnson 4 years ago, and he's just been booted out of Parliament. Well, he's resigned, but he's been sanctioned by the Parliament itself. So the people that the people want, we've seen the same, of course, with Trump in the United States being indicted. Those that the people vote for are then thrown out. And I'm afraid I've got bad news for our friend. That's not democracy, is it?
Well, Andrij, if we look at the situation with Ukraine, now Ukraine is saying that even with the cancellation of the agreement, it will continue to export wheat and other grains. Your thought on this, and how dangerous possibly that this is, because the Russians now are saying actually that they can target these ships. So where are we going with this? When I talked earlier about the situation continually seeming that it is deteriorating, this is another example. Your perspective.
And remember how this grain deal came to be. We had Turkey as a third party invite both Ukraine and Russia to discuss with the United Nations. Again, this is not a deal between the two of them. The United States is not party to the deal, other than the fact then that it is a member of the United Nations. And this was a deal with the Secretary General of the United Nations in trying to make sure that, as I mentioned before, many countries in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, receiving their grain, as well as you mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast, it's the price of grain altogether. So when this large amount of grain, this second largest producer in the world of many grain products, is taken off the market, the prices rise dramatically throughout the world, and that leads to impoverishment as well. So when we have this deal and one party to the deal decides to stop what it was doing, which was allowing passage of ships through individual lanes in the Black Sea. The Black Sea has been mined next to the ports that are still active in Ukraine. Again, many of these silos still with grain from over a year ago, because the process of distributing has been so long. And frankly, it is only through the sea that we can distribute all this grain. It'll take much longer through the rail process. That's something that Ukraine and Europe have been working on in terms of increasing that, but it's never been shipped out directly from Ukraine by rail, and therefore the infrastructure simply isn't there to distribute it. So hopefully, as you mentioned, Ukraine will continue doing what it's doing, and Ukraine's allies will make sure that that grain comes out, even though the aggressor state to Ukraine's north, the one that has committed genocide, the one that continues breaking international agreements, even though that one threatens to dramatically give an increase in prices for grain around the world and possibly destabilize parts of the world. I think the rest of the world, as those 140 and 150 at the last vote, nations at the United Nations condemned what was happening. And that includes nations of the global south, including principalities like Swaziland, including even observer states at the UN. The majority of small ocean states, all of them voted to condemn what was happening by Russia in Ukraine. So we really hope that a resolution is at hand, and that global grain prices can drop back down where they're more manageable for these countries.
Well, Tony, your take. Where do you see this going? Because according to what Andrij just said, he said that Ukraine's friends will help them basically make sure the grains, the ships basically can get out of port. Does that mean more direct conflict with these NATO nations and Russia? And in general, where do you see all of this going?
Well, look, I mean, it's all very well to have NATO and Swaziland on one side, but what's happening on the other side is much more interesting, I think, which is the BRICS countries all getting together and creating a gold-backed currency, which is actually trying to create a firm and reliable economic system in the West. They have completely failed in their economies. There's been so much greed and nepotism and cliquey behaviour at the top in the United States, Europe and Britain, that what's happening is their economies are collapsing. They simply cannot, because of all of the cost of living is so high, rents and food so expensive, that they actually can't afford to manufacture anything anymore and make it competitive on the international market. So they're collapsing economically. Meanwhile, the BRICS countries are getting together and saying, let's have a really solid currency because the dollar is falling apart. The IMF is seen to be far too political. And so those other countries on the other side of this divide are actually looking well ahead and trying to create a stable world for the future. In the meantime, of course, you've got the conflict that's going on between the ruling classes, the elites in the West and in the NATO countries, not only with Russia right now in Ukraine and NATO, but also with their own population. I mean, we've got all these strikes going on in the UK, the public services, people in nursing, in teaching, all these in such important professions. People are just leaving because the pay is so low. They can't afford to pay the rent. They can't afford to pay the mortgage. They can't afford to buy food for their children. So what's happened is the elite in the West is now at war, not only with Russia, but with their own people. And they don't really know what to do, only to solidify their own clique and to try and fight this battle on those two different fronts. And I think, honestly, the policies are unhinged and they need to sit down around the table right now and to start to make sensible agreements, as it seems like people like Ben Wallace in our government, the previous Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, maybe even Boris Johnson, who knows, to sit down and come up with a much better policy when it comes to our next general election, with some kind of peace agreement with the Russians, and actually to stop this war, because the direction that they're going down seems very, very... They couldn't find anybody to replace Stoltenberg at NATO, could they? Nobody else wants to do the job because they can see it all heading for World War III. And there are hundreds of millions of people in Europe and the United States that simply are not going to accept that.
And on that note, I thank both of you being with me on this spotlight. Andrij Dobriansky, Communications Director, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America out of New York. Tony Gosselin, historian, investigative journalist and former BBC employee out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marcia Hashimi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.